I now call to order the Society's 2488th meeting and the annual President's Dinner and Lecture in what is now the 152nd year since the Society was founded on March 13, 1871. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. As some of you seem to know, my name is Larry Milstein. I am the president of PSW, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry. Welcome to our members, guests, and friends to tonight's PSW meeting and the lecture by Michael Neufeld on the Artemis program and returning to the moon to stay, ? Tonight is the occasion of the annual President's Lecture, and we honor the event by using the Society's ceremonial gavel, pictured here, hewn from the timbers of the White House, used in rebuilding it in 1816 after it was burned down by the British in the War of 1812. It's always good to keep in mind that enemies can become friends. According to the brass plaque, the wood used to make the gavel was recovered from the White House in 1927, not when it was rebuilt during the Truman administration, as I have erroneously said in the past. And this is what the White House looked like on the inside when it was being rebuilt in the Truman administration as a result of it being nearly condemned for being unsound. Some of the wood from that refurbishment was turned into paneling that now adorns several of the rooms in the White House. And we're pleased to have this small connection to the nation's history and to uphold the history of using this gavel made from wood of the White House to call to order the annual President's meeting. We are grateful to PSW Full Year Series sponsor Mike Hilton and Hilton Associates. Please join me in thanking Mike. His very generous contribution was instrumental in keeping the Society in the black last year and is helping to do the same this year. And we are also grateful to PSW member Tim Thomas, who's also with us tonight. Thank you, Tim, whose contributions have also been instrumental in keeping the Society in the black. I think we have another one. No. Well, I have shortchanged myself here, so I'll just have to say thanks also to the law firm of Milne White Solano and Brannigan, where I'm a partner, for sponsoring tonight's lecture. I'd like to say that PSW has been given a donor match by a generous supporter, and all contributions from now through the end of this month will be matched 2-to-1. For every dollar you give, PSW will receive $3 in total, your dollar and 2 matching dollars, up to a total of $20,000 in matching contributions. So now is a great time to make a donation to support PSW financially. Everybody can rush the stage now and check out their checkbooks and, Okay, thank you very much. I can wait till afterwards. I am pleased to announce the following new members. Brad Wolven, a finance professional at the Treasury, interested in astronomy, who learned of PSW through Eventbrite. Sabina Sheridan, Director of Finance for the Northern Virginia Science Center Foundation, an assistant professor with the Data Sciences Department at GMU, broadly interested in science, especially mathematics, computational data science, and AI, who learned of PSW from Anna Naden at the Quantum Physics Meetup in Chicago. Mary Catherine Wickens, independent compliance and anti-fraud expert, interested in data science and analytics and AI, and emerging technologies in litigation and other dispute resolutions who learned of PSW from watching PSW videos on the internet. And tonight's speaker, Michael Neufeld, who actually is already a member by virtue of having spoken before, so now he's a double member and his dues will be double. Whose interests will be clear in part from tonight's lecture. And we welcome them all to membership. All members are entitled to a signed copy of Volume 1 of the Bulletin of the Philosophical Society of Washington, and if you have not received yours, please come see me after the meeting. If you're interested in membership, you can access a membership application on the PSW website on the home page, and you can click the Join button at the upper right on the home page, and it will take you to the appropriate forms. Or you can use the QR code on the cards at the back of the room. We've gotten very up to date now. Recording Secretary Scott Matthews will now present the minutes of the 2487th meeting and the lecture by Catherine Huff on advanced nuclear reactors. Scott.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, everyone. On December 15th, 2023, in the Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., President Larry Milstein called the 2487th meeting of the Society to order at 8:02 p.m. Eastern Time. He began by welcoming attendees, thanking sponsors for their support, and announcing new members. Scott Matthews then read the minutes of the previous meeting, including the lecture by Missy Cummings on self-driving cars. The minutes were approved as read. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Dr. Catherine Huff, Assistant Secretary of Energy for Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy. Her lecture was titled Nuclear Energy and Advanced Reactor Designs. The speaker began by stating that her goal was to present an overview of different reactor types, the basic physics of reactors, and the design variables associated with different reactors. She indicated that the design variables were dictated by reactor performance targets, such as reactor size, operating temperature, output power, fuel type, and reaction kinetics. Huff then presented the basic physics of fission reactors. She discussed neutron interactions, which include scattering and absorption, neutron moderation, cross-sections, fission products, and the three classifications of fission isotopes: fissionable, fissile, and fertile. She indicated that an isotope capable of undergoing fission after absorbing a high-energy neutron is considered fissionable. But isotopes that can readily undergo fission with low-energy or thermal neutrons are considered fissile. Whereas an isotope that can absorb a neutron and become fissile is referred to as fertile. Dr. Huff then discussed the importance of reactor kinetics, explaining the concepts of criticality and reactivity, emphasizing the desire for a stable reactor with negative feedbacks to prevent runaway reactions. The impact of temperature on resonances and the Doppler effect was discussed, with a focus on how temperature changes can influence reactivity. She presented the concepts of breeding and burning, creation and destruction of nuclei that lead to changes in isotope concentration during reactor operation. Huff discussed how the buildup of fission products would lead to changes in reactivity. She also discussed the fact that many fission products have half-lives on the order of minutes, thereby creating delayed neutrons, which must be considered when modeling reactor kinetics. Huff then described the difference between a fast reactor, in which the fuel fissions by absorbing high-energy neutrons, and a thermal reactor, in which the neutron energies are dramatically reduced by a moderator before initiating fission. The speaker then turned to specific advanced reactor designs, giving details about a number of reactors that are currently in the design or construction phase. These included the TerraPower Natrium reactor, the X-Energy XE100 high-temperature gas reactor, Keros Power's Hermes reactor, Westinghouse's eVinci reactor, WBX Technologies Pele prototype reactor, and the Idaho National Labs Marvel microreactor. These advanced reactors use a wide variety of cooling technologies, including light water, high temperature gas, molten salt, liquid metal, and heat pipes. and several different fuel geometries, including conventional oxide fuels, metallic fuels, pebble bed fuels, and TRISO, or tri-structural isotropic fuels. Huff ended the lecture by mentioning a number of other research efforts being funded or overseen by her office at the Department of Energy. These included molten salt reactors, a database of molten salt properties, fast reactors, integrated energy systems, materials for reactors, and microreactor testing facilities. The lecture was followed by a question and answer period. One member asked when the DoD would, quote unquote, pick a winner amongst the various design concepts being proposed and tested. Huff replied that such a decision would be much easier in a country like France, where the electric utility is wholly owned by the French government. She indicated that more than 40 private reactor development companies have approached the DOE, and that the DOE has already down-selected to a much smaller group, but that ongoing research and free market economics would have to decide this question in the future. Another member asked about the possibility of using collections or swarms of microreactors, similar to the way high-performance computing uses collections of microprocessors. Huff responded that such an approach would require the construction of quote-unquote meta-factories to produce the microreactors in order to have an economy of scale, and that currently the cost per kilowatt hour of microreactors was significantly higher than the cost per kilowatt hour of gigawatt-scale facilities. Another person asked about the Vogtle commercial reactor in Georgia, which he claimed was completed 7 years late and $17 billion over budget. Huff noted that multi-billion-dollar construction projects in the U.S. often have such difficulties. By way of example, she mentioned Boston's Big Dig project. She indicated that these mega projects are often subject to market forces and economic considerations that the developers cannot control. In particular, she noted that during the construction of Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4, the construction required 8,000 skilled tradesmen. Such a workforce was difficult to find in rural Georgia, especially in a highly competitive job market. A question from the web asked if commercial reactors were forced to use their original analog controls because of regulatory hurdles associated with NRC approval of modern digital controls. Huff confirmed that analog control rooms are a standard in commercial reactors. She indicated that the NRC was currently walking through the full digitization of a control room, with plans to have it fully licensed by 2026 or 2027. Once that process is complete, she said, other commercial reactors can be retrofitted and recertified. The question and answer period concluded with a question about advanced technologies for storage of nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. Huff responded that while her office focuses on advanced reactor design, there are other offices within the DoD that focus on the quote-unquote disposal and disposition of spent nuclear fuel. She indicated that this office has several research and development programs on integrated waste management, including storage and transportation technologies. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker and presented her with a PSW rosette, a signed copy of the announcement of her talk, and a signed copy of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin. He then announced speakers for upcoming lectures, made a number of housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the Society. He adjourned the 2,487th meeting of the Society at 10:01 Eastern Standard Time. Temperature in Washington, D.C., 6.1 degrees Celsius, weather, fair. Attendance in the Powell Auditorium, 61. Viewers on the live stream, 27, for a total of 88 live viewers. Views of the video in the first 2 weeks, 586. Respectfully submitted.
Scott Matthews. Thank you very much, Scott. Do we have any comments or corrections on the minutes? We have a hand here.
I think this read at the end regarding the story,
The comment is that at the end you said DOD, but probably it should be DOE. Those government acronyms is enough to drive anybody crazy. Yes. Okay, so with that one correction, the minutes, without there being further suggestion or correction? Up, Bob? Oh, premature motion, yeah. I will entertain a motion to accept the minutes as read. Thank you, Bob. I will entertain a second. Do I have a second? All members in favor? All members opposed? Hearing no opposition, I will accept the minutes as read, and they will be posted to the website in due course. And we now turn to tonight's lecture by Michael Neufeld on going back to the moon to stay, the Artemis program and the past and future of human lunar exploration. Mike was a senior curator in the Space History Department of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum until he retired last year, 2023. He is an historian and has written on the development of rocketry, the German and American space programs, and various aspects of the history and holdings of the National Air and Space Museum. He's also a former speaker, and a recording of his previous lecture, which related to Wernher von Braun and the American space program, is freely available on the PSW website and on the PSW YouTube and Vimeo channels. Mike is an author, usually solo, on over 100 scholarly and popular articles, and on 4 books. Among other honors and awards, Smithsonian Secretary David Skorkin gave him the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award, the highest research award of the institution, and, more importantly, asteroid 329018 Neufeld is named for Mike. Mike earned a BA in History at the University of Calgary, an MA in History at the University of British Columbia, and an MA and PhD in History at Johns Hopkins University. All questions will be fielded after the lecture during the Q&A session. Mike, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you, Larry. So thank you for the invitation to the Society for having me on this prestigious occasion. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to talk of something about that was actually the product of an article that I published last month in Physics Today about Artemis, and I was invited to write this article, and it sort of addressed a question that has been on my mind for years. So, as a space buff, going all the way back to the '60s, so I lived through the '60s. I was a space fan in the '60s. Then I became through a roundabout route curator at the Air and Space Museum, and I've been observing the space program for years, and I've been observing this program. This is not the only thing I write about, because actually I've been writing about planetary exploration a lot lately, but I've been observing the Artemis program for several years, and it has raised a question in my mind. Is this program sustainable? Does it have any public support? I mean, I think, in fact, it will be interesting to see the reaction of the first moon flights. Artemis II is supposedly in later 2025 and landing in later 2026, if those happen on time. Will the public wake up to the fact that we have a human lunar program that they didn't even know about? I know this is an informed audience. You probably know about it, and they got a little bit of publicity from the Artemis I unmanned test in December 2022, so a little over a year ago. But the question is this a sustainable program? Which is why, sorry, I've been told not to look at the screen, but to look at that, why this has a question mark. The question is this, are we going back to the moon to stay? Are we building a base? These are NASA's plan. Can this be sustained? And I'm going to give some reasons tonight why I think it will be, in spite of the lack of public support or the little interest of the public and the weak support in public opinion. So as I note on this slide, our total lunar experience with humans is 4 years, from the end of '68 to the end of 1972. And since 1972, December 1972, no human has been more than 400 miles from the Earth. So fundamentally, the history of human spaceflight is we went to low Earth orbit, Then the United States ran to the moon for 4 years, and then we retreated back to low Earth orbit where we've been ever since. And there has been no lunar program, no human lunar program that has been sustained. There have been several attempts, as I indicate on my questions here. So, you know, number one question, why has it taken 50 plus years to go back to the moon? Or maybe the question, maybe alternately, the question is, why are we doing it anyway if we stop doing it? Another question I have here is, why is this going forward when there were two major announcements in 1989 and 2004 by Bush one and George H.W. and then George W. Bush, each announced we were going back to the moon and onto the Mars with humans, and nothing came of it. Yet somehow today we do have a program. So it's an interesting question in my mind. What is it that explains the failure of those two initiatives and why this has emerged as seemingly having some staying power, and we're actually serious about, as we are now, about sending humans back to the moon. So as I'm an historian, obviously, and this is fundamentally going to be an historical talk, although at the end I'm going to talk a bit about the current elements of Artemis, what's being built, what it's supposed to do. To give you some more background, if you probably could use some more detailed background on what Artemis is actually trying to accomplish. But I think my basic conclusion is, it is not a flash in the pan like Apollo. It appears to have some staying power, regardless of the lack of enthusiasm in public or the lack of knowledge in the public. I believe it will, both for geopolitical reasons and for domestic political reasons, why this program is entrenched and likely to survive at least into the 2030s. Now, to go back to the origins, I'm skipping over Apollo, and I must say, one part of my biography I wish I had put in, but I forgot to, was that I was the lead curator on Destination Moon. So if you want to see an exhibit about Apollo, I highly recommend you go down to the Air and Space Museum and see part of our new exhibits as we're reopening the museum or rebuilding the museum about Apollo. But my subject today starts after Apollo. And what is the aftermath of Apollo, and why does the moon, Mars, for human exploration just fall off the table and stay off the table effectively for 50 years? Obviously, the fundamental reason in the early 70s was the collapse of public support. That did not start in the early 70s. In fact, Congress started cutting NASA's budget in 1967, in the fiscal 1967. And already 2 or 3 years before any astronauts land on the moon, NASA's budget was already in decline, as the spending peak to get to Apollo was passed, and there was no enthusiasm for a deeper commitment for a more ambitious program. In 1969, the then administrator of NASA, Tom Paine, whose name will come up again shortly, tried to sell a program to Mars, and I'm the biographer of Vanna von Braun. He was told to go out and tried to sell a program for a human expedition to Mars in the 1980s, and that fell totally flat. And in the course of 2 years, from 1970 to 1972, NASA essentially was in a bit of a free fall. There was no public support. Nixon had been elected. Nixon was not an enthusiast of a program that had been basically identified with Kennedy and Johnson. And the country was confronted with Vietnam, with the quagmire in Vietnam, with riots in the cities, with questions about investment in cities, a rising consciousness of pollution, as it was called at that time. So an environmental consciousness was arising. And the question to a lot of the public was, why are we spending billions on that? We just beat the Russians. Who cares? We'd been there, done that. We succeeded in landing on the moon, and we don't want to spend any more money on it. And so NASA had the momentum to sustain lunar exploration for 4 more years, or until 1972, but there was no future in continuing a program which was viewed by many as incredibly expensive. It cost $400 million per launch, which is equivalent of several billion dollars today. So very quickly fell off the table the various options that NASA was presenting. the first idea was that would be a major space station, and then we would have a new moon expedition, and we'd build the infrastructure to go to Mars. Very quickly, that shrunk to, well, we'll have a space station and we'll build a shuttle. But then the space station fell off the table, lack of enthusiasm in the political class, in the public, in general, lack of interest. And so what was originally just a transporter to carry people to the space station became the real purpose, or the only purpose, of the U.S. human spaceflight program, namely the space shuttle. And NASA, in order to sell it, in order to make it a feasible proposition in Congress and the Nixon administration, had to advertise it as being extremely economical, that it would revolutionize the cost of spaceflight, that it would revolutionize the cost of putting something into orbit, that it would become the thing that would transform spaceflight, space launch, just like the DC-3 would transform aviation. And I think it's very interesting, the NASA leadership, who are largely aerospace engineers, who had originally been out of aviation, had very much this idea that the shuttle would be the DC-3 of space and revolutionize transportation. That was the argument that was at least could sell in OMB, in the Nixon administration, in Congress. And so the administration sort of reluctantly went along, or somewhat enthusiastically went along. As I note on this slide, I mean, the cuts were coming. Nixon wanted to cancel Apollo 16 and 17. And then when that didn't happen, he backed off and he wanted Apollo 17 canceled. And in fact, when I was writing the von Braun biography, I found this very interesting story in the papers of George Lowe at RPI in Troy, New York, that in fact he'd made a backdoor deal with the Nixon White House to not cancel Apollo 17 as long as it came after the election. So that's why, you know, instead of Apollo 17 following 6 months after Apollo 16 in October, it suddenly appeared in December 1972, because Nixon was concerned that there would be a disaster, the astronauts would die, and it would somehow affect the election. So NASA saved Apollo 17, and it had to fight for a shuttle of some kind, and there was a serious discussion of canceling the shuttle as well. And I quote here Caspar Weinberger, who was then the deputy director of OMB in August 1971, is that, you know, he argued that they shouldn't cancel the space shuttle, otherwise we would give the impression that our best years are behind us, we are turning inwards, reducing our defense commitments, and voluntarily starting to give up our superpower status. I mean, I think that's one of the core arguments why human spaceflight has continued and survived, and why it's been built by other countries, is simply because this is kind of the ultimate status symbol of a superpower, or of a great power. To be able to have your astronauts in space is now viewed kind of like as necessity for your recognition as a major power. And which is why now, of course, China and India are both building human spaceflight programs. And other countries have participated, but only in this, only often as riders in Russian or American spacecraft. But the geopolitical argument was there right from the beginning of the shuttle program. Well, we can't just stop sending astronauts into space because we won't look like a superpower if we do that. So Nixon approved, in the end, the shuttle program. This is a picture from with his, Fletcher, who was then the administrator of NASA. And I modeled the shuttle, not quite actually what was built, but in January 1972, Nixon bought into the economic argument that this would revolutionize spaceflight, but he also was interested in jobs in California and for the 1972 election, and and at this point the aerospace industry was in a deep dive and a deep crash, really, an economic crash that took place around 1970 because of both cutbacks in the Vietnam expenditure and also the tail off of Apollo. I've jumped ahead too many here because I'm touching this thing. So that sort of brings up the domestic political dimension of this whole program, that in fact is always about jobs in districts and so forth. So now I'm going backward. Oh, here we go. So the 1980s were dominated by the shuttle. I mean, going back to the moon, sending humans out farther out was not even a possibility at this, or it was something that was debated as something we should be doing in the future, but there was no concrete possibility. The first challenge of NASA in the early 80s was try to make this thing work, to fly it enough times to justify the kind of flight rates and lowering of costs that how shuttle was supposed to be. And of course, that ignominiously failed in many ways. The most NASA ever launched in one year was 9 in 1985, and then came the Challenger accident at the beginning of 1986, and that caused a whole major reconsideration of what the shuttle's purpose was, what it would do. We got away from this ill-considered policy of having the shuttle as the only launch vehicle for the United States government. It's hard in hindsight to see how that could have been an argument that would work. You know, it was part of the technological, I think, hubris of Apollo that we sort of said, NASA said, we can build this vehicle that will revolutionize the cost of transportation, and it will be so reliable that we don't even have to have another launch vehicle. And of course, you know, when Challenger exploded, that caused a huge hole in the launch schedule, and it was also simultaneous actually with other launch failures by other launch vehicles. And so the whole idea that this would be the only U.S. launch vehicle was dead at that point, as well as the commercial use of the shuttle died with the Challenger accident. But Reagan had already approved in 1983 a space station. It was for a while called Space Station Freedom, and in the starting, I guess, in the later 80s, it incorporated from the outset, as had the shuttle to a great extent, incorporated Western allies, Canada, Japan, and the Europeans, the European Space Agency, as part of the space station program. It was the next logical step. This was NASA's repeated phrase, the next logical step for spaceflight. Actually, I don't know if NASA ever had a very good idea what the space station was really for, but it was this idea going back to Wernher von Braun and on many other space advocates all the way back to the origin, and certainly strong in the 1950s, we would have to have a base as a stepping stone to outer space, and a space station would serve that purpose. But as I note here, it immediately was designed and redesigned, and by the time you got to the end of the 1980s, we were still basically doing it wasn't many PowerPoint slides then, but it would be other kinds of slides, and not actually a real vehicle yet. There was a lot of disgruntlement in the space community still with what NASA seemed to be limited, that it was only still stuck with human spaceflight in low Earth orbit, that we weren't going to go anywhere. And so as a result of that, there was, we need a vision. And Reagan appointed a National Commission of Space, with Tom Paine, the former NASA administrator, as the chairman of this commission. And they constructed a grand or grandiose vision of a future in space with multiple space stations, moon base, Mars base, transportation systems, everything in the National Commission of Space. But it went nowhere, and it was going to go nowhere anyway, but it came out literally like a week or two after the Challenger accident. And so the idea is always out there. I noticed this in Reagan. I noticed this in George H.W. Bush. I'll talk about in a minute. This fixation on what Dwayne Day's political scientist Dwayne Day called the von Braun paradigm, that our path in space was space shuttle, space station, moon, Mars. That would be kind of the fixed path we would always go on. And this in many ways was, and with George H.W. Bush, what would also come about. There was another report, the Ride report by Sally Ride led a commission, much more modest, and they talked about the mission to planet Earth. But, and that helped us to start more serious investment in earth sciences, but it did not fundamentally change the situation. So when George H.W. Bush became president in 1989, he was primed to have some kind of visionary space thing. He was an enthusiast of space flight. He was supportive of NASA. He was, as I said, pretty much accepted this kind of standard trope of shuttle moon Mars, shuttle station moon Mars as the pathway to the future. And so on the steps of our museum, and I was standing out on the mall at the time watching this. I was a fellow at the time, not a curator yet. He taught on the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing with Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin in this picture. He gave this speech saying that we were going to go to the moon and onto Mars. And I give these dates here. In fact, he was much more vague about dates than I remembered when I went back and checked that today. But certainly NASA was talking about getting back to the end by the moon maybe by the end of the 90s, or certainly at the beginning of the 2000s. NASA immediately went out and did a 90-day study. This was so-called 90, this is literally the name of the committee, 90-day study to try to produce an architecture and a proposal for going to the moon and Mars. And how would we do that? And what they produced was a political disaster, basically. So they came out with this study. They had this elaborate idea for a moon base, Mars base, and the infrastructure it takes to support that. And the figure that they came up with was $500 billion that you would take. I think the option A was 541 billion and the option B was 471 billion. So they did not give the president and the political class a set of more or smaller, cheaper options. They just gave these gigantic space buff wish list for going to the moon, Mars. That was politically sort of the end of the space exploration initiative, although it dragged on for two more years and didn't officially sort of go out of business until Bill Clinton became president in 1992. The administrator at the time was Dick Truly, who was a Navy admiral, was also notably a shuttle astronaut, unimportant, as shuttle commander, but you know he and the NASA human spaceflight infrastructure bureaucracy were very unimaginative. They just wanted their giant engineering-heavy, expensive way to go, and that produced this huge report, and he didn't really do anything to stop it. Part of it is that, as I noted here, there's the legacy of Apollo and the huge infrastructure. So one of the things that, Apollo fundamentally transformed NASA in the sense that it went from a $1 billion agency in 1960 to a $5 billion agency by 1965, and in the process built a series of space centers across the South, built up Kennedy, Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and Johnson Space Flight Center, which was created out of nothing outside Houston. And this infrastructure needed to be supported. And as far as these people were concerned, they wanted to have support the shuttle, support the station, and oh boy, and then we can just add on to this existing shuttle station infrastructure and also a moon expedition and a Mars expedition. One of the budget realities that this sort of contradicted was this would mean a major increase in NASA's budget. The implication of these figures was that NASA would have to get double or triple its existing budget, which was going nowhere. I mean, on the one hand, Bush and Vice President Dan Quayle, who was head of the Space Council, were at fault for having let this process go on the way it did. But on the other hand, they were shocked and caught off guard by this and by the political reaction, which was essentially dead in the water from day one. But as I want to show in this diagram here, the next diagram, this is the percentage of NASA's budget, NASA's budget as a percentage of the total U.S. federal budget. And I think the numbers on the left don't quite make sense. I got this diagram from Roger Launius, and there's a better diagram in in the book, in the article that I published, but I couldn't get an image version of it, so I didn't have it here. But the fundamental story is the same. You have this, you have this massive increase in NASA's budget. It goes up to nearly 4.5% of the total U.S. federal budget for Apollo, and then it falls off drastically in the 70s, and it hits a baseline down here around 3/4 of the percent of the federal budget. There is a bump around the end of the 1980s because of replacing the Space Shuttle Challenger with another shuttle, and because of Reagan and Bush's commitment or enthusiasm for the space program, for the human space program. And so it gets a little bump that pushes it back up to about 1%. And then ever since, it has fallen to basically 0.5% of the federal budget. I mean, this is not a picture of the NASA budget exactly, because this is a percentage of the total federal budget. So the NASA's budget in recent years has actually been increasing, but its percentage of the federal budget is pretty much flat. And I think the message of this is that the public and the political system are willing to support NASA to the point which it gets 0.5% of the federal budget, but not a lot more than that. That a huge bump in the NASA budget was politically unsaleable in 1989 and has, for the most part, remained unsaleable ever since. NASA is successful. It's one of the most beloved federal agencies, maybe the most beloved federal agency. For the most part, most of the time it has had a very positive image, but people aren't willing to massively increase the national budget expenditure on NASA at the same time. So, the message of the Bush years was, we're not going to change the federal budget that much, and we have the space shuttle and the space station to maintain, so let's try to keep those in business. Of course, as I mentioned here, the early 90s were actually a time when NASA's image was actually quite bad for a while, and there was a lot of criticism, and there was the whole fiasco of the Space Exploration Initiative, but also in June of 1990, the flaw in the Hubble's mirror was discovered. And this was a very embarrassing incident for NASA, and there was a sense of that it was bureaucratic and mired, did not have the elan, the innovation of NASA in the 1960s, and what are we going to do about it? And then on top of that, of course, the Cold War suddenly came to an end, surprisingly, and although there was certainly a lot of discussion with Gorbachev and others about cooperative space programs in the late 80s and the early 90s, the de facto, the major important thing was NASA no longer had this other country to race against. Well, certainly part of the thing that sustained the space station was that the Soviets had small but very active space station program, and why don't we have one? Now this argument, which had funded so many programs, that, well, they have one, so we've got to have one. We've got to race them, we've got to keep up, or we got to beat them, went away. And that sort of led to this era, as I mentioned, of flat and declining budgets for NASA, which you also saw to some extent on the diagram. A bit of a decline in the budget and a larger decline in the percentage of the federal budget. By 1992, Bush administration was fed up with Truly and with this kind of unimaginative leadership, and they pushed him out. And they brought in Dan Golden, who's pictured here, who was actually a TRW executive as a vice president. And they brought him in because he promised to shake things up and do things differently. And it's very interesting that he comes basically at this time from a classified world of the military space, that he was involved with SDI and with programs at TRW relating to SDI. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, had this reputation of being innovative, fast, changing the way things are being done, and NASA had the reputation of being bureaucratic, slow, and expensive. And so there was a lot of interest in applying lessons from SDI and the military to the revision to NASA. And Golden's primary idea, which he applied particularly to the robotic space program was so-called better, faster, cheaper, innovative, risk-taking missions that led to the Discovery program, about which I've written. It led to the idea that competition, that there would be also competition among centers, that JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, would not you get all planetary missions, and so forth. So there was this, he was trying to shake up robotic spaceflight, but it was difficult to do anything about the shuttle and space station. And the shuttle soldiered on, but the station was fundamentally saved because of a geopolitical deal with with Russia, as the Clinton administration, as a part of trying to make sure that Russian rocket engineers did not go to Iran or North Korea, wanted to prop up the Russian space program. And so the Russian station program was incorporated with the U.S. International Station Program, and it became the International Space Station in 1993, 1994. And that led to shuttle missions to the Soviet, or Russian Mir, originally Soviet, now Russian Mir space station, and to the construction of ISS. And these are the first two modules, Russian on the left and American on the right, as they were joined in 2000. So space station construction is the next real task for the shuttle when it's lacking another fundamental purpose. The station became its purpose. But any attempt to replace the station went nowhere. There was little commitment to spending the money to replace the shuttle, which of course landed us in the problem in the 2000s that for almost 9 years, or for about 9 years, we depended totally on the Russians to put our astronauts at the space station. So when George W. Bush came into office in 2001, there was an existing NASA study at the end of 1999, 2000, basically, what is the new millennium? What are we going to do with the human space program? What are we going to do with NASA? And that was the first place you see the idea of a spacecraft for deep space, which effectively becomes the Orion spacecraft for Artemis. And the origin of that idea is then, but it's another shuttle accident that again forces a fundamental reconsideration of U.S. space policy, with the breakup on reentry you see on the upper left of Space Shuttle Columbia on February the 1st, 2003. Once again, NASA got the reputation of being unimaginative, slow, and not reforming itself, because the subsequent investigation demonstrated that almost all of the problems of NASA culture that had led to the 1986 Challenger accident were just repeated. That a risk to the mission, a risk for a catastrophic accident was examined and re-examined and re-examined behind the scenes, but never taken seriously to the point of stopping shuttle launches or changing the way business was being done. And suddenly, we had another accident. And so the criticism once again was NASA has no imagination, it doesn't know where it's going, it's just slogging, the human spaceflight program is just shuttle station, we don't know what we're going to do after that. And so that led to the younger Bush's vision for space exploration, which he articulated in the beginning of 2004 at NASA headquarters, not as grand as his father's speech on the steps of the Air and Space Museum, but actually the NASA headquarters auditorium, which was a moon by maybe the 50th anniversary of the first landing in 2019, maybe even earlier if it could be done. Mars would come sometime thereafter. So I think there's many ways vision for space exploration showed that he and his people had learned something from the failure of 15 years before, namely, don't propose a giant program that's going to immediately be dead because it's too expensive. Try to do something modest. The argument in the vision for space exploration budget that was laid out was that there would be a small increase in NASA's budget, $1 billion over 5 years, and then the shuttle would come to an end because the Columbia Accident Investigation Board had recommended ending the shuttle when the space station was complete, which was actually indeed a promise that the United States stuck to, finally. Because I have to say, honestly, the shuttle was the most dangerous human spaceflight spacecraft we've ever built. It had no escape system for a launch accident. So that was the plan. And the budget would be more modest. The gain would come as the sort of budget wedge for the station, and then the shuttle went down, the shuttle disappeared, would be phased out, and there would be a budget gap or a budget opportunity post-2010. Well, that didn't really work out that way. It's not really what actually became the fate of Constellation. So this program was renamed by ultimately, and I'm not quite sure whether this happened, just before Mike Griffith became the administrator of NASA in 2005. There had been another administrator, O'Keefe, between 2002 and 2004, but I'll pass over that. Not the best administrator the NASA has ever had. And he said, we need to focus this program. It is sort of, okay, we've got spending a lot of money, we're trying to go to the moon and Mars, but we don't know what we're doing. I should note, however, that, in this case, Mars was even vaguer than it was in the 1989 initiative, or much vaguer. Because, I think it's, sending humans to Mars is rhetorically visionary as far as the public, the presidents are concerned. If you want to sound visionary in your space vision, send humans to Mars. That's our ultimate objective. But the reality of going to Mars is so much more difficult than going to the moon. It always seemed to end up being just, okay, well, we'll do that after we figure out how to go back to the moon. And Griffin said, we should focus our attention on building a moon landing infrastructure. And Mars will come later when we figure out how to do that. First, we have to do that. And he created this. These are the vehicles that were the launch vehicles that were supposed to be built for Constellation. Though on the left, the smaller one is Ares 1. Was actually a stretched solid rocket booster from the space shuttle with an upper stage stuck on top of it. And that was to launch the Orion, or what became to be called the Orion capsule, in orbit. And then there would be a heavy lift vehicle called Ares 5, which would lift the lunar lander. And if you know NASA acronyms from Apollo, there was the choice of Earth orbit rendezvous or lunar orbit rendezvous. In the case of Constellation, it was both. There would first be a rendezvous in Earth orbit with the lunar lander and the upper stage from the Ares 5, and then that would send the combination to the moon. And you would have, in lunar orbit, something like Apollo leaving the command and service module, the Orion command and service module in orbit, and going down with the Altair lander. Totally shuttle derived. You can see, and you'll see also in what became the derivative of Ares 5, the Space Launch System, the SLS, is it looks a lot like the shuttle. It looks a lot like the shuttle in the bottom half because it's fundamentally stretched solid rocket boosters, 5 segments instead of 4 segments. So the shuttle, the solid rocket booster is longer, therefore it has more burning surface area, it has more thrust. And a stretched external tank from the shuttle turned into a rocket stage. And what are the engines on the bottom of the Ares 5? Shuttle main engines. And that was the idea. In fact, I think from the very beginning there was this idea: let's reuse the shuttle infrastructure, not only the parts and pieces of the shuttle, but also the plants and so forth, the companies. It really is, let's take the shuttle and turn that into a moon landing program. However, this program, while it did not die immediately like SEI did, had a slow and painful decline, or slow and painful decline into just spending billions of dollars without really getting anywhere, which certainly reminds me of a lot of the history of the space station until it was actually built. the Bush administration seems to have lost interest. The president seems to have lost interest. Of course, these were the years where the United States became mired in Afghanistan and Iraq, very expensive, and at the very end of the Bush administration, into a major financial crisis. And so the promised plus up, even in smaller increase in NASA budget, never happened. And the dividend of ending the shuttle and even ending the station, because in the original plan, we were going to build a station by 2010 and then ditch it in the ocean in 2015. That would be the argument of that program. Said, well, we need the money to go to the moon, so we're just going to ditch the space station soon after we build it, which never would have been very popular, notably with the contractors, with the foreign partners who had invested billions, who have invested billions in ISS. But at any rate, that dividend was in the future and not happening. And so the net result was that it was going nowhere. And when Obama was elected in 2008 and president in 2009, there was obviously a financial crisis, but at the same time, there was a lot of, as example, with the COVID federal investment, a lot of money was thrown at it to keep up jobs. And so money was thrown at NASA to keep it going. But when Lori Garver, who was a space policy analyst who became the deputy administrator of NASA under Obama, looked at this program for the transition team, she discovered that 4 years into the program, it had lagged 5 years. So it was further behind at the end of the Bush administration than it was at the beginning in terms of actually getting anywhere. And so Obama, at the beginning of 2010, canceled Constellation. And the question is, go where? There was some elite committees, notably Norm Augustine of Lockheed Martin, who had sat on many of these elite committees deciding what to do with the space program, said, well, we could have a flexible path where we decide where to go later, but maybe we go to an asteroid. So the idea of having some kind of asteroid mission and giving up on the moon was where this program seemed to be going. But that produced an uproar. So 2010, this cancellation did not go over well. In fact, it was a political failure that left the White House in an embarrassing situation. There was a revolt in the among members of the space community, of leading astronauts. This is a congressional hearing where you see here Neil Armstrong on the left, Gene Cernan in the middle, and Norm Augustine on the right here testifying before Congress about the astronauts said, we're basically throwing away American future. We're throwing away the space program. The way we should build a space program is the way we've always done it, with the people who've always done it, with the NASA centers, with the contractors who've always done it. And there was very much in Congress a concern about the collapse of employment at NASA centers and contractors as a result of the end of the shuttle program. So that in 2010, the shuttle was not going to end until 2011, but the end of the shuttle program was on the horizon, along with massive layoffs, notably at the Cape, with the whole shuttle workforce, because, we'd kept the shuttle going, but it required a whole standing army of technicians to keep it flying, even on a regular basis of 5 or 6 times a year. And all those people are going to be unemployed. And what's going to happen to Huntsville and to Lockheed Martin and to Boeing and to then the solid rocket contractor Martin Thiokol, which is now in part of Northrop Grumman. And so leading senators basically started pressuring the White House over this. Obama's first concession was to not cancel this spacecraft, with the Orion spacecraft. The first excuse was, well, we'll use it as a rescue vehicle to go to the station occasionally or something like that. But, that was not satisfactory. So this program, which is basically about a modernized Apollo Command and Service Module, was revived or was not canceled. The second thing was a campaign to create a large heavy lift vehicle, which has turned out to be basically a revision of Ares 5, a shuttle-based heavy lift vehicle. And notably in the middle of that were Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, who had had Huntsville, had Marshall Spaceflight Center, and all the aerospace contractors of the Huntsville region, which he was a great champion. Bill Nelson, who's now the administrator of NASA, Senator of Florida, championing employment at the Cape. And so that was basically, we can't let all those people be unemployed. We can't go through a massive layoff cycle. So we'll create a program and basically force it down the throat of the Obama administration. We would have a heavy lift vehicle and we would have a spacecraft. We weren't really clear what we were going to do with it or where we were going to go with it. In fact, of course, the WAG called the SLS, which I guess I don't have a picture of it here, but if I go in the next picture, you see there's a picture of SLS from Artemis I. SLS was designed to support, Morton Thiokol, Marshall, Kennedy, Boeing, and so forth. And so we got this program, which was a very expensive booster program, which was, in hindsight, I think, a mistake. But one of the realities of the time is we now live in the era of SpaceX and the revolution that SpaceX has accomplished in terms of reusable boosters, lowering of costs, and everything else. That was not true in 2010. SpaceX was a small, struggling company in the early 2000s. There had been a long history of commercial launch vehicle companies failing and making great claims on paper and then going out of business. And so nobody was clear that SpaceX was ever going to amount to anything. Now, in fact, SpaceX had been saved, effectively, as Musk himself will say, by NASA, because NASA, one of the innovative things that Griffin did was to say, well, if we're going to sustain the space station, we need a commercial cargo program. We can't have NASA launching on its own boosters all the cargo to sustain the station, at least from the American side. We will hire commercial companies. And so there was a commercial cargo competition, and SpaceX, and this is the first version of SpaceX's Cargo Dragon, was one of the contract winners, and that money allowed SpaceX to build the Falcon 9, which has now been turned into a reusable vehicle, at least first stage is reusable, and launched on a regular basis. But as I said, in the 2010 environment, there was no, I think if this whole thing were done now, we might say, why are we spending billions on SLS when we can go out and hire a commercial launch company to send the astronauts or to build a new booster at a much lower cost? But as I said, it was very much embedded in the idea of sustaining the jobs and infrastructure that had been built from Apollo and sustained under Shuttle. Out of that came commercial crew, the idea that we should also have a crew vehicle to launch to the station. That fought for its survival during the early mid-2010s in 2013, 14, and 14. NASA awarded a commercial crew program to SpaceX and Boeing, and it's notable that at this point, SpaceX is totally successful, and Boeing has yet to launch a single astronaut on its, and they hope maybe this spring they will actually launch Starliner finally. It costs billions more, or it costs $1.5 billion more than the SpaceX fixed price contract, and it's yet to fly. So as we go into the 2010s, SLS and Orion go on, but they, again, deadlines are slipping, they're not moving ahead, their billions are being spent. Part of it is that there's no investment peak like Apollo. There's no huge investment at the outfront to build something. Instead, it's like the money is trickled out at $3 billion a year or whatever. And so timelines stretch out. The traditional aerospace corporations are very used to having these cost-plus contracts, have no particular incentive not to have delays, because if their costs go up, they just get the money anyway. So there's very little motivation. So they drag on. The question is, where is it going? For a while, under the Obama administration, the idea was so-called asteroid redirect mission, where we would, because Orion was inadequate to go directly to an asteroid, we would send a spacecraft to retrieve a boulder off an asteroid, bring it back to the moon, and the astronauts would go sample the boulder. That was the asteroid redirect mission. Not a very inspiring program, but that was the excuse for spending billions a year on Orion and SLS. The idea of going back to the moon sort of got in through the back door, which is interesting. So how did Artemis emerge? The name, as I mentioned down here, is not until the Trump administration gives it a name, but the moon sort of comes back into the picture, because the astronauts were going to have to go out to a lunar orbit in order to sample this asteroid. And NASA was beginning to talk about constructing some kind of station in lunar orbit. The idea was always, this was about building infrastructure to go to Mars later. How are we going to get experience in deep space if we don't actually fly into deep space? And that's an argument I can buy into. That, you know, if you never do deep space exploration, you're never going to know how to do deep space exploration. Although the challenges, notably with human health and radiation, are extremely large. So, when the Trump administration comes into office in 2019, see, I got this wrong, 2017, sorry. When Trump administration comes into office, Vice President Pence is given, the National Space Council is resurrected for about the fourth or fifth time. It's always created under some presidents, mostly Republican presidents lately, and then disappears in Democratic administrations and then reappears again. And they're usually the vice president the head of it. Pence is the head of the program. He named a new administrator, Jim Bridenstine, and they decided, going back to the moon, we have to get serious about that. There were plans in NASA maybe for a landing in 2028, which is now longer a date that seems that unrealistic for this program. But he said, we will land on the moon by the end of 2024, which not coincidentally was supposed to be the end of Trump's fortunately avoided second term. And it was a blatantly political goal. It did have the virtue of saying, NASA, here's a focused goal, try to do this, rather than somewhat spending billions and not somewhat indefinite deadlines going away into the future. And as I said, I think the best thing they ever did was name it Artemis, mythologically sister of Apollo. But the program was motivating in terms of the deadline, but I think unrealistic from day one. So I note here, Artemis I did finally launch last year, about 5 years later than originally planned, and successfully flew this one mission around the moon. Part of this program was to create, was to find a new commercial solution for the lander. And so the new Artemis program, because in the interim, between the origins of SLS and everything around 2010, 2020, suddenly SpaceX and prospectively maybe, although they still have to prove it, Blue Origin is going to develop a large launch vehicle. There was now commercial alternatives. And so what we have now with Artemis is really an interesting mashup and combination of new and old ways of doing business. You know, the old way of doing business was in the SLS and Orion, which sits on the top of it, is a NASA-bought vehicle under traditional federal acquisition regulations, and NASA owns it and operates it. On the other side, the landers are supposed to be services bought from a company. And so in 2021, NASA awarded a contract to SpaceX, $4 billion, for a lander version of Starship. And I guess you've probably heard, and we'll see a picture in a minute, of the Starship gigantic launch vehicle, which was just launched for the second time in November. 18 million pounds of thrust, sort of double the size of any launch vehicle ever built. Well, that huge second stage is supposed to have a lander version. I think this drawing is completely notional. I have not seen I'm sure NASA has the blueprints and the images, but they're not publicizing what Starship will actually look like. I mean, to me, I look at that thing and I say, number one, look at the people down at the bottom. The scale is mind-boggling. They're going to have to climb down a very long ladder or something to get to the bottom. And I do wonder about having a huge vehicle with little legs. I'm sure the legs won't be that size, but the tipping factor of that vehicle makes me nervous. I mean, it really does. And I assume the final vehicle won't look exactly like that. But there was also an argument in Congress that NASA should have two suppliers, and this has become the new idea. We should have two suppliers for all the. So there's both a competitor to spur competition, but also that if one fails, at least we have the other alternative, which is why we have two commercial cargo contracts, and now three, and when we have two commercial crew contracts, although Boeing has yet to deliver. And so in 2023, Blue Origin, that is Jeff Bezos' company, did succeed in getting a contract for Blue Moon, which is the vehicle drawing on the right of a second lander, which is supposed to be used later in the 2020s. Now, as I mentioned, the program has constantly slipped, and it was just like a lucky coincidence that this week the news, because just as I was writing this slide, the news came out, as you may have heard, that the Artemis II mission, which is a circumlunar loop with 4 crew, 1 Canadian, I should say, and I like that idea because you notice from my background I'm Canadian, is now going to be at the earliest September 2025 instead of at the end of this year, although I didn't believe the end of this year was going to happen. And the Artemis III landing will be allegedly in September 2026. In November, the GAO issued a report about this and noted that this date, the original date at that time was writing to the December 2025 date for the landing, was not very believable, and it could be as late as 2027. That's an error on the slide. I just checked the GAO report yesterday. But it was saying, all things considered, a landing before 2027 is unlikely, and that looks pretty good, because if the current target is September 2026, what are the odds that it actually lands on September 2026? But two major challenges from this. There's a new spacesuit that's being designed, and again, we're using the commercial model here. NASA will hire a company, Axiom now, to build a spacesuit which it will own and effectively rent to NASA, who will use it. Will supply the service of having a spacesuit. And SpaceX is supposed to build this version of Starship, but meanwhile, Starship is yet to orbit the Earth successfully and may on the 3rd try. But it's not just that. This vehicle will have to be refueled multiple times in Earth orbit. So SpaceX infrastructure is that it will launch a propellant depot in Earth orbit, and this Starship uses methane and liquid oxygen, and that would top up this depot in Earth orbit with multiple Starship launches. So you're going to need many Starship launches just to top up the propellant depot in Earth orbit. And I think part of the problem is that liquid oxygen is one of the propellants, so there's a boil-off problem with liquid oxygen. But in any case, there will be multiple Starship launches until you launch the Lunar Starship, and then the Lunar Starship goes and fuels itself up in orbit after launching itself into orbit, then has to be refueled in orbit, and then it will go to the moon and go into orbit around the moon and meet the astronauts there. These are some diagrams of the mission profiles for Artemis II. This is supposed to be, as I said, in September 2025 now, is the latest objective. It will have a high Earth orbit test, And then if that 24 hours, and of course these are not to scale, so the apogee of this orbit was much higher, but most of the way to halfway to the moon. After the 24-hour orbit, everything is okay. Then it will fire up its engine and make a free return loop around the moon. It's not even actually a lunar, I thought it was a lunar orbit mission like Apollo 8, NASA's first lunar mission. But it will loop around the moon in 2020 and loop around the moon and come back to Earth. And this is the somewhat mind-bogglingly complicated mission profile for Artemis II. Now, to me, maybe this is just looking back on Apollo, but we're going to go directly from just looping around the moon to landing on the moon, and there's no test missions with astronauts in lunar orbit in between. That to me is worrisome. But the profile is to launch. The Starship will already be in this elliptical lunar orbit, and this particular orbit was chosen for the station in lunar orbit, which I'll get to in a minute, called the Gateway, called the near rectilinear halo orbit, and it's basically has a paraloon that's only about 1,500 miles over the moon, and then it goes out 70,000 miles. And it's called a halo orbit because it actually uses the gravity of the Earth and the moon to create an orbit which is fairly stable and doesn't need to be constantly to be adjusted in order to stay in that orbit. But at any rate, it will go in the Orion spacecraft will go into orbit around the moon, meet up the Starship lander in lunar orbit. In this, the lunar orbit, the crew will go down, and now we trust our spacecraft enough not to leave an astronaut behind like we did in Apollo, but to have all four of them go down to the surface in the lander and then come back up and rendezvous with the Orion vehicle and come back to Earth. It smacks a bit of a stunt because, in any ways, this was the product of the Trump-Pence administration's decision. We want to get to the moon in a hurry, so we're just going to have a mission before we construct the infrastructure to stay in lunar orbit. This is a NASA image of the Orion docked to the Gateway station in near rectilinear halo orbit. I think one thing about this spacecraft that's unique, the service module is built by the Europeans. It's actually a European Space Agency contribution. But it does look a lot like Apollo, except now with solar panels and some other details. This is a picture of a recent drawing of the Gateway Lunar Space Station. And it's constructed here. You see, where we got? Yeah, we got the Orion here. We have, on this end, we have the first two elements that are supposed to be launched, the power and production element, which has both conventional and ion thrust engines, and then it has in the middle a sort of segment in the middle for joining, but also a temporary habitat, a interim habitat, and then in the future, a more elaborate habitat that the Europeans and Japanese are supplying, a Canadian arm in the drive from the shuttle and station arms, and a logistics supply vehicle, and so forth. And this station was supposed to be constructed in lunar orbit in the late 2020s. It has been heavily criticized as being a waste of money by many space enthusiasts or space engineers who do not like it. Its values, I think, is more about, in the long run, understanding how to operate in deep space than it is supporting the lunar landing. But in all the landings after Artemis, from Artemis 4 on, all the landings are supposed to start with the crew going to the station and sort of parking out there, then getting prepared to go down to the surface in one or the other of the commercial landers, and then going down and coming back up to the station afterwards. It's an ambitious plan, and the question is, okay, is this going to be sustainable? Which, of course, is my ultimate question. This is an example or NASA drawing of the iterations of Space Launch System. If SLS Block 1 on the left reminds me, or should remind many people, of a cross between the shuttle and the Saturn V, and in many ways that's what it is. It actually has an interim upper stage, which is not very powerful and will be used on 1, 2, and 3, and then it's supposed to be replaced with a more powerful upper stage on SLS Block 1B, which in theory has also a cargo version, and then supposedly a much more powerful version with new solid rocket boosters and a lengthened core stage is supposed to come in the future, Block 2. The question is, of course, is this going to be fiscally and technically sustainable, especially in view of SpaceX? With SpaceX, SLS is supposed to cost $4 billion every time it's launched. And at this point, they're launching one every 3 years. I mean, in the future, in theory, they're going to launch one every year or so, or a year or two. But it's compared to Apollo, where things were very race-driven by the Cold War space race, and we were could launch a Saturn V every 2 months, as we did in '69. This is, SLS is once every year or two. Meanwhile, Starship is on the horizon. The question is, will SLS be sustained when it's so expensive? And Starship, and maybe later on, Blue Origin's New Glenn vehicle make it much cheaper. So I know another vulnerability of this is, and these are specific numbers from this year, from a Pew poll this summer, said, what are NASA's top priorities? And I assume that from public, what the poll participants were offered was a laundry list, and you like this or this or this. And the answer was 60% supported asteroid, defense against the asteroid threat, 50% climate change. The moon is only 12% support, and Mars only 10% support. So the public is indeed sort of much more interested in what's going to protect it against future threats than it is about the moon and Mars. But public support may be lukewarm, or even the people don't even know about it, as I mentioned. So it's bringing me to my last slide and my concluding slide, which is, the political sustainability of this, and why I believed and why I argued in the Physics Today article last month, why I thought this program is going to last, regardless of a weak public support or disinterest. As I mentioned, as I tried to lay out, which is why I thought it's worth going through all of that narrative particularly about the failure of the 2 earlier Moon-Mars initiatives, was domestic political support is essential, particularly when it comes to jobs in districts which congressmen and senators want to keep in their districts. And the problem with those earlier initiatives is that they wanted to pile a program, more ambitiously with the first attempt, less ambitiously with the second attempt, put another program on top of the existing shuttle station infrastructure, and that meant increasing NASA's budget. Large extent or little extent, never seemed to fly anywhere. But once shuttle was over and station was built, although it still costs a significant amount of money to sustain year after year, there was a budget wedge that did open up finally in the 2010s, and it had to be filled with something. And that something, from the standpoint of Congress, was SLS and Orion and the Artemis program. And so that has this basis in Congress, regardless of how expensive and over budget and late it is, it still seems to have a fundamental basis in Congress. And the other argument, as I said, I think even more compelling, is the geopolitical argument, which Weinberger articulated and has been articulated elsewhere. The United States doesn't want to not have a human space program. It doesn't clear what that human space program is or whether there's a consensus about what it should do, but the idea that the United States would stop flying astronauts, but the Russians and then the Chinese would be, or the Russians actually are, flying astronauts, would be politically unacceptable. We need to have a human space program, and particularly, at least in terms of the international image, and particularly now with the Chinese saying, and they are very They are moving forward in a measured way, but very systematically and successfully, building a program, say they want to land on the moon by 2030. Personally, I don't think that date will happen because they, unlike us, they do not have yet a deep space spacecraft. They do not have the heavy lift booster. Those are on the drawing boards. They're supposed to fly in the later 2020s. But in any case, China is coming, and you can see this race rhetoric is beginning to come back. In fact, in the news conference over the Artemis delays that happened like 2 days ago, Bill Nelson said, "Oh yes, we are in a race with China. We're going to win it." So race. I don't think we're really in the intensity of a space race that was true with the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s, but the rhetoric of racing the Chinese and keeping up with the Chinese is going to continue to be a significant factor in sustaining the Artemis program. So, in addition to that, as I note here, there's also the international dimension of Artemis, and the fact that it has ESA and Canadian Space Agency and Japan's JAXA agency, and now also the UAE has providing a component to the gateway that. It is an international program. It's going to be embarrassing for the United States to back out of it. So my argument is, it could well be proved wrong, but my argument is that under the circumstances, this program will survive into the 2030s and perhaps beyond. Even if we change the vehicles relating to it and give up on SLS at some point, it looks like we are going back to the moon to stay. Like any prediction, I may be wrong, but that's my conclusion right now. Thank you very much.
For those of you who haven't heard this before, there are runners with the microphones. If you have a question, please be persistent in keeping your hand up long enough for a person with a microphone to spot you and bring you the microphone. When I call on you by the color of your microphone, stand up, tell us your name, and tell us if you're a member. We do it this way so we can adjust the mics, unmute them and mute them, to cut down on the amount of background noise and to make sure people who are listening on the live stream and people who will be watching the recording can hear your questions. So I'll start with the blue mic, and the questioner is going to stand up, tell us his name, if he's a member, and ask a question.
I'm
Blue
David
microphone.
Rosen. I'm a member. My question is, are any of these space stations supposed to be at the Lagrange point? Because I remember von Braun was very specific that the space station, in his novel and all, the space station was at a Lagrange point. But now we're sending space stations into very near orbit. Are they really the same thing?
So, do you want to repeat the question, or?
No.
Okay, so it was actually Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s who advocated Lagrange point stations. So and he particularly wanted to put one in Earth Moon L5, which is essentially 60 degrees behind the moon in lunar, sort of as the moon orbits. That was not von Braun's idea. He was very much the old school. We build a space station in low Earth orbit, then we build a base on the moon. We build a base and go to Mars. This is not this halo orbit has somewhat related to this idea of putting a halo orbit around a Lagrange point in space, which is a balance point when you have two bodies and you have a three-body problem. But no, that's not where it is. Now, interestingly, the Chinese put a communication satellite around Earth Moon L2 which is the gravitational balance point behind the moon, because they need a communication satellite to communicate with their lander when they landed on the far side of the moon, which is an idea that Bob Farquhar, who was at Goddard and then later at APL, had advocated back in the 1960s, that if we wanted to land an Apollo spacecraft on the far side of the moon, we need a communication satellite in order to communicate with it. So they have done that. We are of course using Earth-Sun L1 for solar missions and Earth-Sun L2 for astronomy missions like the James Webb Space Telescope at this point.
Matt Kay, member. presumably in 1969, the CEO of Lockheed wasn't going to buy 20th Century Fox, put out a bunch of bad movies, and lose 70% of the value of the movie studio. But we have a situation now where the largest shareholder of SpaceX is doing exactly that. Are there any risks to these programs from I don't know, forced share sales or instability in the sort of financing of SpaceX as a contractor that would cause the whole mission to be at risk?
Specifically regarding SpaceX, they look remarkably stable at this point because they're making so much money. But you raise a legitimate question. Okay, so if we bet on commercial companies, will they deliver on a consistent basis? And of course, we had a small example this week with the launch of the Astrobotic Peregrine, and the spacecraft failed. It was the first time they'd ever launched a spacecraft, so maybe we give them one. But obviously, NASA had given $105 million to that for experiments to be on Peregrine, and they aren't going to make it to the moon. So obviously, this commercial betting on the commercial delivery is got its risks. On the other hand, it's also a challenge. It's a question of that versus potentially saving a lot of money, because as we demonstrated with SLS, particularly with billions and billions over budget, you build something now with the aerospace, traditional aerospace companies, you can build something that's extremely reliable, but it's way over budget and takes way longer than it was supposed to emerge.
I think the question was more of a systemic question, which would go, gee, Elon Musk is doing crazy stuff buying the institution formerly known as Twitter, and is that going to negatively impact SpaceX and its ability to fulfill its obligations under its contracts to NASA?
I mean, as Musk becomes sort of flakier, more problematic, and of course there was an editorial in the Post about last week basically saying, is all these drug problems apparently, should we be having a major corporation that has so much market power, that Starlink is now dominating this low Earth orbit communications, as well as they are dominating the launch market? Can we have sort of, flaky CEO? And
let me introduce a little dose of reality for everybody here. But the reason that they are dominating is because basically Elon Musk is a genius and he got him there. Mm-hmm. And it's not because he's a flake and a risk, but rather he got them there. We wouldn't be able to get to the space station if it hadn't been for SpaceX being managed the way it is and doing what it does. And what's the other side of the coin is Boeing, our great champion, is eating billions and billions of dollars to get its equivalent to the Dragon and has not launched a single successful mission yet. Mm-hmm. Years behind, and we would totally be at sea and relying on the Russians to get to the space station. So we'll see what happens with Starship.
And
but there's a very good chance that Starship will be, well, maybe an order of magnitude cheaper than SLS, and we'll actually be launching things to the moon before SLS. There's a very good chance.
Yeah,
and we'll see what happens.
We'll be launching the lander. That's the one thing we'll be launching, and maybe. He keeps saying there's going to be a tourist loop around the moon.
Yeah, he says he's got somebody who paid for it.
I don't know what it's going to
I think he has somebody pay for it already.
Yeah.
He's very good at getting people to pay for things before they actually are.
Yeah. Well, I think the reality of Musk is that he promises big and he usually delivers, but his timelines are also always years later.
They're always later.
He's very much later. Setting this incredibly difficult goal that's close in the future, and then it always takes years longer.
It's true, but it's not as many years longer as Boeing's years longer.
Yeah, okay.
We're still waiting for Boeing's years longer to end. And let's remember...
I'm not defending Boeing.
I know, but I want to get it. I have this platform, and I'm...
Yeah. And you're going to use it.
It's my little thing is to say, look, this is our money that goes to NASA, and I love NASA. NASA's great. But NASA has become incredibly inefficient in achieving its goals in a cost-effective way. And I don't know how you change that, but as you demonstrated, program after program, billions of dollars after billions of dollars, to reuse the space shuttle, to reconfigure and reuse the space shuttle. So my question to the American public is, you being the American public, why don't we make the government, if it's going to spend this money, actually achieve things? Spend the money, keep all the people employed, have the factories, have the facilities. But for goodness sakes, we could get 10 times as much out of it if it was done efficiently. And then we could go to the moon, we could go to Mars, we could do a lot more deep space exploration. All right, I'll shut up. Jim, stand up, tell us your name.
My question
Vote for
is,
me.
you started your lecture with to stay, and the last words of your lecture were to stay. What does that exactly mean to you and to the NASA programs?
Well, I mean, it's a question of which I put the question mark on it precisely because I'm not sure. You know, the prediction is a risky business, especially for an historian. I mean, when I stopped being when I got to the present and started talking about what the future is going to be, then I stopped being an historian. But to stay seems to mean having this infrastructure of at this point, the vision is a gateway station in lunar orbit and a base on the south pole of the moon. And in theory, we are going, to build this base, and that starting with Artemis II, we're going to build this base. We're going to start working at the south pole of the moon, where in theory, and I'm sure the water is there, but the question is it in a very usable form? There's water in the cold traps at the south pole of the moon, which will potentially not only obviously solve the problem of delivering water from Earth and endlessly recycling it, but actually having a supply of water, but also potentially using it to create liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, rocket propellants out of it. But that's still pretty speculative because, as I said, we don't really know how that water is collected at the South Pole in these cold traps. Is it, very, very dispersed among the regolith, or is there more concentrated pockets of it?
So you're talking about an actual space station on the moon. Sitting on.
I didn't really get into the lunar base. There's hardly even very good drawings of it. But yeah, the theory is that we build a lunar base. And the Chinese are also saying, well, we think that whole gateway station is a waste of money. We're just going to go directly to the south pole of the moon and build our own base. So potentially there's going to be a Chinese international base, which has their allies, and a U.S. international base with our allies, and a couple of nations said they're going to be in both. But anyway, in theory, there's going to be 2 stations on the moon.
If you want to see fanciful designs about space stations on the moon, you can watch the talk by Daniel Innocente and others on basically building lunar habitats. We have the blue microphone.
Connor Nixon. Yeah, I'm a member. Great talk. So my question is about Gateway. It seems like this is a very integral part of the landing process and the Artemis program. Could you comment more on the schedule for launching the components of Gateway and how far along those are?
I went looking for that number because I knew that somebody might ask, or at least I was curious. The only thing I could find, literally on Wikipedia, not on NASA's website, was that the first 2 elements will be launched on a Falcon Heavy in late 2025. And so part of NASA's decision making was they had this power and propulsion element actually derived from a robotic spacecraft that was supposed to go and grab a boulder off an asteroid, will become the power and propulsion part of the station. They decided to launch it together with this preliminary habitat and sort of node where multiple modules can be docked to. Launch it as one thing in late 2025. And I do wonder about that because, basically this thing is not going to get used till 2028 or later. Then in 2028, they're supposed to launch another modules. And so the Europeans are deeply committed to spending a lot of money on this with this IHAB, International Habitatory Lab, and we can maybe backtrack to that slide. So yeah, there's this idea that the Europeans will contribute. And I'm trying to figure out where IHAB actually is in this thing. Yeah. So So that's that. No, I'm just trying to figure out which thing it is here, but that's it. That is the sort of, so the habitat that's in the central node, this first element launch, is going to be somewhat primitive or minimal, and the idea is that you have another living space that's larger, and the Europeans will deliver that module. This airlock on the bottom is now being taken over by UAE. So UAE is actually developing a space program, and trying to become a serious player.
Money can buy you space.
Yeah,
Red microphone. Sorry. What?
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a member of the various steps that you listed, which you think is most critical to the success of the program.
So, yeah, I mean, every mission is critical, but, you know, that landing, as I said, the whole landing idea makes me nervous because, you know, it's not only this very long vehicle is supposed to land on it autonomously. It's that we're going to do it on the first try. There's no practice mission. No, SpaceX has under their contract, they have to carry out one robotic landing beforehand. But they don't actually have to launch it off the moon anyway. But we're going to say our astronauts are going to go down on that vehicle and come back up again successfully, and we're going to do the landing on the moon. So NASA seems to be comfortable with this. You know, it's different than Apollo, where you had more sort of iterative. You know, we test the command service and lunar module. You know, the command service module at lunar orbit. We had the combination Earth orbit, then we test it in lunar orbit. Then we land on the moon. Even that's, you know, done in only four or five missions is pretty fast, but it's a big step, I think. And you know, you wouldn't want an accident that killed astronauts would obviously be a problem. But our history with accidents is that they don't stop the program, because it happened with the Apollo fire and happened with 2 shuttle accidents, and people will say, okay, that, you know, an accident's going to kill the program. In every case, it seems to have fortified the program, or, you know, political public commitment seems to be, you know, that's something that happens in exploration, and we're going to keep doing it. So it probably wouldn't kill the program.
Bob Terry, a member. From your historical perspective, what endeavors in human history even approach the complexity of space, and what can we learn from those few that might do so? And here we have Kabuki theater in orbit, nothing looking like a square dance. We used to just go hunting, and now we have these long, involved trajectories. Is this the only way to do it? Has anybody else done stuff that was difficult for them as this is difficult for us now? What's an historical perspective?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, my imagination is not really I mean, obviously, in the beginning of the space program, the comparison to European exploration voyages of the 16, 15, 16, 17 centuries was very much on people's mind. And the comparison always was, you know, it's like exploring the new world. Well, because we have somewhat different opinion or a vision of what that meant, you know, notably for the indigenous populations. But, you know, it is noteworthy that in those cases, I mean, it was much riskier. I mean, most of the sailors who went out on those things didn't make it, either on that expedition or the next one or something. So it was and there was a expectation of that a lot of people would die, and that wasn't really much of an issue. And now I think, you know, one of the questions that's always been around the human space program is, have we become too risk averse? Are we too worried about killing people to do anything? You know, is that why it's this sort of slow, cautious, and expensive way is dominated NASA's? Certainly when NASA has had spectacular failures, it got politically punished. And, you know, there was an uproar and criticism, although it doesn't seem to have ended with them getting their budgets cut in any significant way. So I don't, if you have an idea, I'd be happy to hear it, but I don't have there isn't a good metaphor or analogy, I think, for this sort of very complex engineering, management driven expeditions as compared to the past.
I mean, my take on it is it's so difficult that might as well cut them some slack and expect disaster.
Yeah, I couldn't hear that, so, okay.
Can somebody bring Bob a microphone?
That's okay.
Well, I would suggest two things to think about. One is to always compare the space program to get to the moon, the Apollo program, with the program to build the atomic bomb. But the other one is that the endeavor of World War II and the engineering that went into building 29,000 B-29s and all the logistics and all the rest of it was a huge undertaking technically, physically, and in every other way that probably compares in scale.
The fundamental technical problems were not as tough as these.
Some were, some were just the application of known.
Atomic bomb was as challenging a technical problem as the early space program. Well, I mean, you know, everyone focuses on the atomic bomb, but the B-29, as Larry mentioned, was a huge, it cost actually $4 billion when the bomb cost $2 billion. Now, of course, the B-29 was built for area bombing or originally precision bombing, but wasn't built for the atomic bomb. But it was a huge technological challenge to build a bomber that was a significant leap over the B-17, B-24.
But it's a really interesting question to think about. Okay, I think we have the red microphone, AJ.
Hi, my name is AJ Kotari. I'm a member. I'm really quite wonderstruck as to why it is that NASA did not figure out that, with calculations even, that using reusable rockets, even the first stage reusable rocket, as SpaceX has been doing and other people have been doing, would have been so much cheaper and so much easier and so much faster to be able to get to the moon instead of the SLS and all that. I mean, I did calculation in 2009, and I found that acquiring the first stage was like 97% of the cost for expendable vehicle, and for reusable, you get rid of that. A fair amount of that, a large portion of that. Why is it that NASA could not see that?
Well, I mean, I kind of wonder if there was a bit of leftover experience of the shuttle, which left disillusionment. That was exactly what the shuttle was supposed to be. I mean, the shuttle started out as the fully reusable two-stage vehicle, and in the original idea, it was supposed to be both vehicles, both the booster and the second stage were supposed to be piloted, and part of this budget cutting and retreat and trying to find a shuttle that could be sold to the Nixon administration was this compromise where the solid rocket boosters would be reused, and they were reused. In fact, the SLS solid rocket boosters, they're reusing the segment, the metal segments from old shuttle rocket boosters. I mean, I think part of the problem with SLS is they started to bet on this whole strategy of reusing, saying it was going to save money to reuse old shuttle engines and reuse old shuttle solid rocket segments to build ISLS, and that would save money. And there's not much any evidence that it would save any money. It's a very good question about, so why didn't reusability never appear in these plans? I mean, even the recovery of solid rocket boosters that was the norm in shuttle and did work is not being shown in SLS. And part of it is also just the economies of scale. They only launch one every 3 years. It's not going to save much money. So SLS is and Larry spoke more dramatically than I did, but SLS is a huge expense, and it seems very old-fashioned now because the thing ends up in the ocean on every flight, and they actually they hired Rocketdyne to build a new expendable version of the space shuttle main engine, and because at some point, after a few SLS launches, they'll have used up all the supply of old shuttle engines. You know why we have no real shuttle engines on our shuttle Discovery at Haase? Because they're being put on SLS. And they took some nozzles they have. If you look at the shuttle behind the firewall, there's nothing. It's just a nozzle. but it looks from the outside like a complete thing. But
There's, yeah, there might be another consideration, which is, well, I had read that people at NASA and elsewhere did an analysis, and they didn't feel that they were going to save much money if they did
Yeah.
this. But the other thing is, if you look around the world, there's really so far, I think, only one company that's actually, besides SpaceX, that actually landed a rocket, and it was not in orbital. So landing a rocket, a booster, is really, really hard. And despite the fact that SpaceX has shown you can do it, and not only can you do it, you can do it in tandem, and not only can you do it in tandem, but you can land them right in the middle of an X. Other entities that have tried have not succeeded, and and that might have been in NASA's thinking
Yeah.
too, that it's much harder to actually get this thing that's going at these hypervelocities and land them through the atmosphere and get them steered to where they have to go.
yeah, and there's a cost in doing that landing. Namely, you have to save some propellant for the burns to sort of boost back burn, to sort of break the booster and bring it down, and you need landing legs and systems so it has those grid fins for maneuvering. It has these extra equipment. That extra equipment on a Falcon 9 booster, that takes away from performance because it's extra weight and extra propellant that you don't use to put something in orbit. But they have succeeded in demonstrating that because they're reusing it so often, they're saving a whole lot of money, and it's worth that expenditure of payload capacity.
There is a payload cost, but most launches doesn't seem to be a problem for SpaceX. There are some SpaceX launches where they have deliberately decided that they're not going to land their boosters because they want to use all the fuel possible. They want as much boost as they can possibly get. So
that's usually the U.S. government usually saying we have a bigger satellite to launch. So that actually happened with a national security launch recently.
But they only
we'll dump the booster in the ocean because we want the maximum performance on the lifting capacity. But yeah, I mean, Larry's right. This is an amazing accomplishment. Blue Origin has done it with the New Shepard suborbital vehicle. The problem is that their orbital New Glenn vehicle has been late. Now it's supposed to launch this year. It's supposed to have a recoverable first stage. I should note, the second stages are always thrown away or have been because there's just not really a practical way to bring them back from orbital velocity.
Okay, is there another microphone somewhere? Ah, yes, from the web, blue microphone, Andrew.
Okay. Hello. We have two questions from the web. The first is from Nick Carter, who is not a member. He wants to know if you could estimate the amount of private funding going into space annually, and if you could translate that into a percentage of federal funding.
I didn't understand all that. Did you understand?
I think the question is, in the days of the Apollo program, where funding for the space activity of NASA was very, very high as a percentage of GDP, there was no private enterprise space activity. We're now living in an age with quite a lot of commercial activity, both the conventional kind of putting telecommunications satellites into orbit, it's military, and space, things like SpaceX. I think the question is, okay, if you take all of that activity, how does that compare as a percentage of GDP? How much private space enterprise is as a percentage of GDP?
I would say it's still very small as a percentage of GDP, but obviously has taken a very become very important in terms of certain sectors. Now, the history of space commerce is that for some decades, the only thing in space that made money were communication satellites. And the dominant model was the geostationary 24-hour orbit. That made money, and so commercial companies could, launch satellites and make money off it. Then came the orbital observation, especially after the Cold War and the loosening of constraints, orbital imaging is starting to make money. Launch has only started to make money really in the 2000s, and SpaceX has demonstrated that they can do that much cheaper and force the market to respond. But it's hundreds of millions. It's hundreds of billions of dollars total, so it's not an insignificant part of the GDP, but I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head.
NASA budget is plus or minus 20 billion.
It's 25, 26.
Is it up to 25?
So on the mid 20s at this point, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so 100 SpaceX launches at 100 million apiece is not half that.
Well, they are sustained in part by still by the communication satellite business, now by their own communication satellite business, Starlink. So,
indeed. Another question from the web.
Yep, we have one more question. This one from William Angel. He wants to know, is there any way to get around the refueling issue, or do we really need to launch a dozen rockets per moon landing?
Yeah, this says Starship is designed fundamentally to be a fully reusable vehicle, but this lunar lander Starship wouldn't be. Now, it's possible that I think they'd probably want to go in the direction of having something that would be multiply reusable, either coming back to Earth orbit to be refueled, or having a tanker go out and fuel it in lunar orbit so that you don't throw it out after every mission. I'm not quite sure what SpaceX's plans are there, but I assume that has to be part of their plan. Now, and that's also very legitimately also part of Blue Origin's Blue Moon plan, more explicitly, was that includes a tanker that would take propellant out to the vehicle and refuel it so that the same lander could be reused multiple times.
Yeah, I don't know about SpaceX's moon plans, but in his notional and perhaps illusionary plans to get to Mars, the Starship is specifically designed to be a tanker and to be refueled in orbit and to make the transit on the way to go to Mars after being refueled in orbit from the tanker version of the Starship. I don't know how that plays into the moon program.
Well, they're getting money from NASA to try to prove that because they need to do that for Artemis II. So.
Yeah, we had a talk on the immortal satellites. It was basically there's a DARPA program and a NASA program on refueling satellites to prolong their life. And I guess some of that's actually being tried out. Okay, we have a red microphone somewhere. Red microphone, thank you. No, you don't have to turn it on, it should be on. The on-off business is happening in the back there.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lillian Solonic. I'm not a member. I had a sort of speculative historical question. I'm wondering if, was there a point in our history, maybe sometime in the 60s or 70s, where if a certain event had gone a different way, we would have continued going to the moon? Or do you think our abandoning the moon was inevitable because of the sort of broader forces, or was there a coincidence or some event that could have changed that?
Yeah, I think regarding Apollo and specifically, I mean, actually there is that TV series which I haven't watched, For All Mankind on Apple TV Plus, which is basically this counterfactual history where because the Soviets landed on the moon first, there was a vigorous space program that continued in the 70s and 80s, and we ended up on Mars. In many ways, the space enthusiast fantasy of an alternate future where we didn't just quit after we went to Apollo. Apollo is a very specific decision made by Kennedy and the U.S. political establishment in 1961, feeling like the United States looked bad, constantly losing in the space race. And specifically, that decision came like only a few weeks after Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. So, if the United States had somehow launched an astronaut before the Soviets, would we have rushed off to the moon? Maybe not. But it's hard to see how Apollo would have been sustainable without an ongoing Soviet moon race. And what we know a lot more now about the Soviet space program history, because the opening after the end of the Cold War, which is now sort of, archives are now kind of closed off again because of Putin. But we know that the Soviets tried to do a human lunar landing on the cheap, and they couldn't afford the money. They didn't have the money to do testing and everything else, and it was a miserable failure. And so it's hard to come up with a scenario under which the United States, the Soviet Union would actually have sustained a lunar program. They sort of racked up all these spectacular first satellite, first animal in orbit, first human in orbit, and first woman and the first thing to hit the moon on. Like 5 or 7 years where they one spectacular after another. Then the United States geared up, and the Soviets could not afford to compete. And the thing I've always asserted about the Soviets is that we could afford to have an ICBM nuclear arms race. We could afford to build the ICBM and Apollo, and the Soviets could not afford to keep up with the nuclear arms race and the moon. And the Soviet leadership chose, especially after the humiliation of the Bay of Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, they said, we're going to build more missiles than the United States, and we're going to be, they're going to end what they perceived as the American threat to the Soviet Union, or stymie the American threat to the Soviet Union by building a massive ICBM force. And there was no money to go to the moon. So I'm having a hard time seeing any scenario under which the Soviets could have built a lasting moon program.
As far as the Apollo program continuing, there are, I think, probably any number of things that were happening culturally in the United States at the time that, if they weren't happening, might have been different. We had the Vietnam War and all the controversies about that. We had Timothy Leary, the Pied Piper of LSD and other psychedelic drugs, and the Cultural Revolution that was surrounding that. We had riots in the cities. We had tremendous amount of social strife. And an awful lot of people saying, we can't afford to go to the moon. What good is it anyway? We have a lot of social problems we need to address. And if all of those things hadn't been the way they were, and people were more attuned towards national prestige, then maybe we would have continued with the Apollo program. But we didn't. And it is a real oddity of history that the country went to the moon and then didn't go back for 60 years. It's a peculiarity, and especially through a period of time when technology is improving exponentially in just about every field that's important to going to the moon. So history is very odd.
One way to look at it is it may have just been incredibly premature, and now we have a technology that makes it more sustainable.
Could be. Yes, we have any other questions? I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but no questions right now. So before we go, let me give you a few tokens of thanks for your talk. And first, let's start with a nice round of applause. So we have our PSW ribbon, which has emblazoned on its side, not really emblazoned, but embroidered on its side, stripes that are, what do you call it? Not illustrative. Can't think of the word, but they come from the symbol for the Henry, for our founder. Now we have signed a copy of the announcement of your talk, framed copy, signed by the members of the General Committee on behalf of the membership, and a signed copy of Volume 1 of the Philosophical Society of Washington, where you'll find the founders, why they founded it, why they called it the Philosophical Society. And as I like to say, and sometimes it's, maybe it's still funny, that you can find an article telling you how to calculate pi to 30 decimal places. They didn't have computers or AI.
Yeah.
And with that, thank you so much.
For the excellent questions.
All right. Before you go, a few words about the remainder of the spring schedule, I am admittedly a little behind on getting commitments for all the upcoming dates, so you're just going to have to check the website. 3 are written now in ink. The 2493rd meeting will be on March 15th. The speaker will be Eric Klein of George Washington University. As many of you know, Eric is an archaeologist who's written many books on the Mediterranean Bronze Age and the collapse of civilizations there. And he previously spoke at the 2351st meeting on October 9th, 2015. His talk then was entitled Sailing the Wine Dark Seas. Video of that talk has been viewed over 46,000 times. Probably was a good talk. The 2494th meeting will be on April 5th. 2495th meeting will be on April 19th. The speaker will be David Spergel. David is a physicist and currently is president of the Simons Foundation. He chaired the panel on UAPs and likely will be speaking on unidentified aerial phenomena. The 2496 meeting will be on May 3rd. The speaker will be Richard Pyle of the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. And he'll be speaking on deep ocean corals and will tell us about the innovative equipment and methods he developed that have allowed him and others to dive and to spend very long periods of time at very deep depths to study these corals and the flora and fauna that inhabit them. Other likely but not certain speakers in the spring schedule include David Atschuler of Vertex, who will be talking on gene therapy. As some of you may know, Vertex has the first FDA-approved gene therapy for sickle cell anemia, in this case. I am trying to get Masahiro Subakura to speak. He is a public health expert who studied the aftermath of the Fukushima tidal wave that put out of commission the nuclear power plants there. And he came to this somewhat counterintuitive conclusion that the really bad effects of that disaster were not the release of radiation or the effects on the nuclear power plant, but the public health measures that dislocated all the people and caused them a great deal of distress. So I thought that would be an interesting talk. We have Jeffrey Duda, who has agreed to talk, but we don't have his date, is dam reclamation. So there's a movement in the United States to get rid of old dams and to let the rivers run free and let the fishes do their thing and replenish fisheries. And he is in charge of the largest dam reclamation project ever undertaken in the United States. And he's an ecologist and a biologist, and it should be interesting to hear what he has to say. Also talking to Ben Schneiderman, and he will be talking on artificial intelligence and computer-human interactions. And finally, John Clauser. I have my fingers crossed. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and I'm hoping he'll come and talk on entanglement. Because we've never had a really, really good talk on entanglement that explains the mysteries of quantum mechanics in a way that leads us to not be uncertain. Of course, that's an impossibility. So let's thank our crew. Thank you. Got the joke. Let's thank our crew for producing this meeting and recording the program and editing and posting the video to the PSW website. I believe we have our editor in the audience. Is that you, Bill? There's our hardworking editor who turns this over in 2 days. Thank you so much. And with that, I will adjourn the 2488th meeting and the annual President's Lecture to the social hour. Do I have a motion? Second? All in favor? All opposed? Meeting is adjourned.